Hi everyone. Hi Cerys.
Hi Dan.
Thanks for everyone that's joined sort of live to watch us now, and obviously the people that are going to see this further down the line. But yeah, I think for an intro perspective, obviously I'm Dan. I'm one of the directors and co-founders at Infinite Talent, supply chain and tech recruitment company based here in Birmingham. My guest today, but soon to be co-host next year, Cerys Johnson, is actually my former manager and still mentor, I'd like to say, and former CEO of REPL Group, now part of Accenture. So welcome, Cerys, from me.
Thank you very much, Dan.
No problem. but yeah, I think to set the scene for this webinar, this is a kickoff webinar for a series that Cerys and I are going to co-host throughout the coming year. So 2023, we're going to look at doing up to, as a minimum one a quarter of these, maybe more if it generates a bit of a following, etc. But definitely one a quarter. We'll invite a couple of guests each, or at least a guest each, and cover topics which we have got an interest in, but B, the collective have got an interest in as well. So we're obviously open to ideas. I think we wanted to just do this one as a bit of a toe into the water, given potentially the UK economy at the moment. It's a bit of a hot topic, and speaking from a buyer's perspective, Infinite are internationally expanding as well at the moment. So I just thought it's a good place to start. I think from a live audience perspective as well, if you've got any questions, just pop them in the chat, and we can either answer them as we go along if they fit the topic, or we'll certainly cover them at the end. There'll be enough time. Obviously, we've got an hour, so we should be able to fit everything in. But yeah, that's I suppose the background and the mechanics of how it should all go smoothly. So I think first and foremost really is just to sort of pass over to Cerys and let Cerys introduce herself and talk a little bit around A, her background, but B, what she's doing at the moment, and her sort of current interests.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Dan. So a lot of people might not be aware of REPL Group. I'm assuming that most people are aware of Accenture. So as Dan said, I used to be the CEO of REPL Group. It was founded in 2007, and I joined in 2010 when we were just 30 employees strong. And by the time we were acquired by Accenture in March 2021, we had around 400 employees. We had grown consistently year on year. We were originally UK based, and our head office remained in the UK, but we also had three other additional offices within the UK, and we had international offices. We had two in the US, we had an office in Hamburg in Germany, Cape Town, South Africa, Tokyo, and Singapore. And what REPL did was large-scale systems integration, specialist software configuration, implementation, development, data science, test automation, managed support for our clients, predominantly large retail clients. And we had expertise in the areas of supply chain, workforce transformation, in-store technology, and head office systems. Throughout the 11 years that I was with REPL, we actively looked to grow. We had a few smallish acquisitions, but it was predominantly organic growth. And our international growth was a very significant part of that. And as I said at the start, conscious that not everybody may have joined at that point, I'm not an expert in any of the areas that we're going to be talking about today. And in fact, one of my biggest pieces of advice would be to engage with the experts. But I'm very, very willing to share some of the stories, some of the gotchas, some of the watch outs, and also some of the things that worked really, really well, things that surprised me, and just some, all the learnings that I've had from there.
No, that's an awesome overview, and to sort of follow up on that. I think my time at REPL consisted with some of that international growth as well, and I know obviously Cerys and I, some of the conversations we had, it was very much not trial and error. I think we were a little bit better than that potentially, but there was a lot of throwing ideas around about how we do certain things, how we do, not do other things. And I think if I'm looking back on, what was that, 4 years ago now, or 5 years ago, I think if there was a webinar like this 4 or 5 years ago, I'd have been attending this just to understand what other people are doing. And recently in my journey, when Infinite are looking to expand internationally, someone here within the parent company introduced me to a tech recruiter in the US, and we had a very similar conversation around what's good, what's bad, what's ugly, what don't, and all that sort of thing. So I think if anyone takes one bit of information from this today, or offers some information to Cerys or myself, I think it's a worthwhile fact. And I did say at the start, obviously, I think everyone will realise, politically in the UK at the moment, there's a lot of instability is probably the best way to put it. And I think that's caused economic challenges to a lot of businesses. And there's a perceived I suppose view at the moment that the UK market isn't going where it needs to be, going backwards, in fact, obviously recession, etc. Hence why I think international is a good topic, because yes, we're in this market here, but I speak to customers and people all the time, and they're having certain successes in their international business versus UK business in different markets. So I think Cerys and I had a chat over lunch about this a few weeks ago, putting the worlds to rights. But it'd just be good to get your take on the current fiasco, I suppose, is the best word that we're facing in the UK right now.
Yeah, don't sit on the fence, Dan. So yeah, I mean, this isn't going to be any new news to anybody. It's really, really, really challenging times that we're living through. We've gone through Brexit, we've gone through COVID. The war in Ukraine, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and then the disastrous trust-squatting mini-budget that happened, that, all of these things compounded as people that are running businesses or involved in businesses have been significant stressors that have come one on top of another, without the opportunity for recovery and a reassessment and a rebasing in between. And out of these things, there have been winners and they've been losers as well. So, there is that balance to take. But ultimately, the forecasts for the UK economy are negative. The UK is forecast to have the highest wage pressure growth globally, with the Eurozone not far behind. A lot of that is driven by surging energy prices as a result of the Ukraine war. The labour markets are really tight. Talent is a scarcity and a big challenge across most employers. But I think it's also important to say that it's not just the UK. Globally, times are changing. COVID was a global issue. So whilst the UK is forecast to contract in terms of GDP over the next 12 months, global GDP is set to increase by just 1.9% next year. So it's still growth, but it's not the incredible growth that perhaps we've experienced previously. And the demand appears to be weakening in the major economies as well. And if you exclude the COVID effect and the global financial crisis that happened, we're looking at the slowest rate of global growth in 4 decades. So we need to just sort of be mindful of that in what we're thinking about going forwards. I'm a massive believer, though, that we shouldn't talk ourselves into a recession. So I prefer to take the more optimistic approach and then look to, form a really realistic assessment of risks and then mitigate against those, as opposed to a shutting up shop approach. Because ultimately, it's the businesses that do something different and the businesses that put themselves out there that will be the ones that will be successful. So it's that sort of risk and reward strategy as well.
No, I agree with pretty much all of what you said there. I think it's very important to understand, obviously, people on this call and people that listen to this call are probably from different angles. There's going to be people that sell products, there's going to be people that sell services, there's going to be people that maybe sell both. You said there, Cerys, about the pandemic had winners and losers, etc. And I think that's the case in a lot of these things. So Brexit, there would have been winners and losers. Pandemic, there were a lot of losers, unfortunately, but there were some winners. You know, you look at Peloton and the software we're using now, Zoom, and, you know, the biggest radical change of working practices the world has ever seen in the space of a short period of time, which actually, you know, when you talk about the tightness on talent in a market, actually COVID made it, in the middle of COVID, it was actually quite weird, because, you know, people were being given more flexibility or were moving to companies that had flexibility. So actually attracting talent, if you had the right working practices, was interesting in the pandemic. I think I'd use that word. And then obviously we were coming out of that. I'd say we were coming out of that in this part of the world. Obviously, from a supply chain perspective, we still see problems with like things that are manufactured or produced in China and those sort of geographies where restrictions are still, you know, pretty intense, and that filters through, doesn't it, to all the other UK economies. You know, I saw something the other day about, it was like Jaguar Land Rover, one of the car manufacturers that still can't get chips from China through to their manufacturing facilities, which is still COVID related. So obviously we were, you know, it wasn't the big bang coming out of COVID. I think the West thought when they lifted all the sanctions because of the lingering, obviously, sanctions in the Far East, but when you add obviously the ongoing war in Ukraine to all of that, and the cost of moving goods and moving anything and you know, energy in general, I think it's unsurprising that growth. It's unsurprising there's growth at all, really, let alone a small bit of growth. And I think you're right, Cerys. I think it's about identifying and diversifying those and looking for opportunity in an otherwise potentially bleak landscape.
Yeah. And there are opportunity areas out there. So if anybody's looking to expand overseas, I think there are certain countries that are going to do better than others. The US, relatively speaking, is going to be doing better. Countries like Australia and New Zealand are going to be doing relatively better. India is going to be doing relatively better. So I think it's not a reason to go, right, we're going to change our strategy and we're going to look at these markets. But there are some countries and just some underlying fundamentals in those countries that mean that they will perform relatively better.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's looking at each sort of territorial region on its merit and understanding simplistically, I guess, a bit of a SWOT-like analysis on that particular region of what they're going through. Sort of, you know, a lot of these, you look at America and Australia, they're pretty self-contained as an economy themselves, you know, because of their own resources and things they can do, you know, their lack of reliance, I would say, on other resources. So yeah, that's really interesting. It leads really nicely actually into the next kind of point about, you know, when is there a right time to expand? When is the right time to expand? Very open question there.
Yeah, and it really does depend upon individual circumstances. So I think there's opportunistic expansion, and with REPL we did both the opportunistic expansion and the strategic expansion. So the opportunistic expansion was when a client wanted it. So there was a piece of work that we were doing. They wanted us to do it overseas in the US. We knew that demand was there. It was a very low risk way of entering that market because we knew that we had a business case that we could set up from the get-go, and we knew that we had a large company that was willing to back us there. The other reason is, you know, if there's specialist skills there, you know, Brexit significantly impacted the free movement. So it may be a time that, as a consequence of Brexit, or as a consequence of realizing that there are specialist skills in a particular region, you go there. It may be that there's an acquisition opportunity, in which case, you know, it's an opportunity to reassess whether you establish an entity in that region as well. And then strategically, you know, obviously moving to another country opens up market opportunities in that country. It de-risks the reliance on just being reliant on the UK market exclusively. You get access to new talent opportunities, new customer opportunities. It can also mean that if you're selling a product or a service that perhaps not so much has gone stale, but that has got a perception in the UK, you can actually relaunch it and reinvigorate it without any preconceived ideas about what it is in another territory. And also the other thing as well is, there are certain places that are quite considerably cheaper to operate out of than the UK. So it gives an opportunity to re-engineer your cost base as well. What I would say though, it's probably easier to talk about when not to do it. So I would say if your business is already stretched, then don't do it. If your business is under stress, don't do it. If you're not completely clear why you're doing it and what success looks like for you, don't do it. It takes significant time, effort, money, energy to open up overseas. So if you're not in a position where you can dedicate that to it, then it's not the right time. And don't do it on a shoestring. Don't do it when you're short of cash. It will cost more than you think. It will be more challenging than you think. It will take more time than you think. And the other piece of advice as well would be, don't spread yourself too thinly by going for too many new markets all at the same time. So it's having a business that's solid in the UK and then looking to go and extend somewhere else, and then waiting till that business gets to a point of stability and then moving to another market then.
No, that all makes sense. I think for me, I think the biggest takeaway from what you said there was, from an opportunistic point of view, there can be no real good time, because obviously by definition it's opportunistic, and it would depend on if a customer wanted X, Y, and Z in a certain territory, and that viably then builds a platform, doesn't it, to allow you to grow in that territory, and almost you're utilizing that customer or that contract to help you build in there. And it's a not a joint venture, but it's certainly a joint effort, because you're going to be focusing on that customer and giving you that platform. I think in terms of is there a good time to do it strategically, then from what you said there makes perfect sense when you talk about when not to do it. So, I think personally speaking about Infinite, we've seen significant growth in the 4 years we've been trading here in the UK. So, you're looking at 50% growth year on year. Will we get another 50% growth next year? Hopefully, but maybe not. So is that the right time then to look at a different territory potentially to continue the growth trajectory? Because I think it's not about plateauing. I don't like to use that word to describe our business, but hyper growth, in my opinion, the hockey stick can only last so long before it starts to tail off. But actually, I think you could potentially, get a new hockey stick in new territories if you can try and replicate and provide the same level of either product or service in the new territory strategically rather than opportunistically.
Yeah, absolutely. And any time that you're thinking about doing something like this, it just makes sense to use just common sense disciplines that you'd use in any time you're planning a significant investment. So approach it like a project. So have timelines, have a plan, have a budget, know what your go, no go decision points are, know what your success metrics look like, but really importantly, also know what your walkaway position looks like, and fully understand the risks, and then put in place plans to mitigate those risks. And it's not just looking at financial risks, but it's also looking at things like cultural, regulatory challenges, and as I said before, I use the adage of measure twice, cut once. So get good professional advice, because it does cost so much more to try and unravel it, and take so much more management time and add risk into your business if you don't get it right at the point of setup.
And that professional advice is fundamental. I know when we were doing our things with looking at the Indian talent market, we were looking at America. I remember sitting on several, I think it was EY seminars, etc., to understand the nuances of a local labour market. We've got three 3 questions essentially in our Q&A, and a lot of the theme, we can box them off at the end if we've got time, but the theme is basically talent scarcity. What type of workforce would you hire to support international expansion, and how would you access local markets when expanding internationally? So it's, without any bias, they are genuine questions. It is about recruitment. So, what, I guess from a staffing perspective, like, I know when we're looking at it now, it's a challenge around, who do we send people from the UK? Do we staff locally? Because of the scarcity of staff globally, I guess, and across borders, it might be, I know when REPL did it in America, I know you guys had a really good approach, and that worked obviously spectacularly well from you guys. I don't know. I'd pose the question: is it easier now to do it with your current employees than trying to attract new ones? However, the flip side to that is it's if it's an international expansion, it's a bloody good opportunity for someone to come in and do that for you as a talent offering. But it'd be good to get your thoughts on the staffing side of it, really.
Yeah, and some of this will depend upon, so there's 2 ways that you can set up overseas. It's as a branch or a subsidiary. And if you're a branch, in basic terms, you're connected to the parent company. So the parent company is still responsible for any liabilities that you have. The parent company has complete control. The financials are all joined together. The operations are completely controlled by the head office function. And then there's a subsidiary organisation. So that's where it's majority or wholly owned by the parent company, but operates as a separate legal entity. And in this case, it doesn't necessarily have to do the same business as the parent company. So it does give a little bit more flexibility. You have separate accounts maintained, and also there's no parent company liability for this subsidiary. So there's pros and cons to each. And it really does depend upon individual circumstance about which one would be better for needs. But one of the key things that we found, so if I talk about our experience of going to the US, so initially we created a business case. So we had a client that wanted us to do work in the US. That was great. But that was only part of the story. We needed to create a business case in order to secure company visas. So we could raise visas as REPL to sponsor people from the UK to go and work in the US. So that was a process in itself, and we were given 5-year visa status. What that actually means is that every person from the UK that we wanted to send to the US, we would put through an assessment process, and they would hopefully at the end of it be granted a visa that would then allow them to work in the US for a period of time. Now, this worked brilliantly well for about the first couple of years, and we had a core team of people who were all British expats living and working in the US. And then we had graduates that we recruited in the UK. Salaries we lower in the UK than in the US. So we recruited UK grads and then shipped them over to the US. That was fantastic, worked like a dream until, and it wasn't any official change, but the US immigration then decided that they were only going to grant visas to people that had very demonstrable, unique skills that we wouldn't find in the US market. Because rightly so, they were looking to protect their own workforce and create jobs within the US. So that then changed entirely. And that was without consultation. It was without any sort of formal change, but it was a sentiment change. And we had to respond to that because otherwise our business would have been damaged. And so then we pivoted entirely then to try and have a US team sourced from US nationals, and that actually was really, really the pivotal point for us in becoming a proper US company, because without having those US employees, we hadn't really understood the culture, we hadn't really understood the nuances, we hadn't really understood how relatively competitive we were in the marketplace. And as an example, we were sending people there with UK style employment contracts. Obviously, they met US legislative requirements, but there were some things where we'd been way too generous, like vacation allowance, like paid sick pay, like maternity leave. Because we'd been following UK principles, and there were other areas. I can remember having a really emotive discussion with somebody about why we didn't let the team have the Friday after Thanksgiving off as a holiday, because that was custom and practice in the US, but it wasn't custom and practice in the UK. And the argument that, well, you're getting more than double the holidays that your US colleagues would have just didn't wash at all. It was more the emotive piece that we didn't recognise the importance of this holiday to them. So I would recommend that if you can, it really it pays back hugely to recruit locally, but to also properly listen to what the local team are telling you, and to also get the local professional advice as well. Because if I talk about when we expanded in Germany, the German company setup was extremely complicated, but it was also certain customs and practice about allowances that you give to people on top of the salary, certain customs and practices about the bonus that's expected. So it's those things that don't tend to be written down that you can tend to miss, but actually have a massive impact on how successfully you land there.
And I think I remember when we did the first trip to US recruitment when I was there, which was still quite far down the line, right, from when REPL actually went to America. But that first recruitment trip, I remember speaking to the candidates on that trip about our diluted down benefits from obviously when it was the first iteration of when you guys went over there, and they couldn't get their heads around how generous it was compared to other US companies. And now, I guess, in times of challenge, that could be an area to save a bit of money, save a bit of cost. But actually, in a time of scarce resource, I think if you can look at a local example and be different, be better. I'm not, obviously, don't go ballistic and give people, like you say, overly generous and insane things based on the local standard. But I think anything above that, I think, really is attractive, because obviously, especially like REPL were at the time, when I was there, we weren't a household name in the states we were going to, in Dallas, in Seattle, Atlanta. We weren't if you knew WMS, you probably knew REPL potentially, but it definitely wasn't Accenture, for example. And I think, trying to attract good people who were at good companies, I think the benefits package as was then, I think it was something very, very interesting to look at. I think if you're in a business now, anyone on this call or the recording that does employ people overseas, or is looking to hire overseas from your whatever base you might be in, whether you're in the EU and you want to hire in the UK, or whether in, I don't know, US and you want to hire in Europe, or whatever it is. I think it's good to get an understanding of the local norm around these things, like Kerry said, with the professional advice, and just take some stock of what, we've done numerous salary surveys and benefit surveys for our customers, and just understand what that looks like. And if you can be better, I think that does, I think it's quite an emotive thing to say, like, look, we know we're coming to this country and we'd like to, offer you a benefits package befitting of what we offer our other employees in other parts of the world, obviously, if it's better. But I think it leads nicely on into the things to consider element when you are moving, expanding globally, etc. I think it's I think there's a lot of things to consider. There's things that, we haven't done it yet. We haven't put our first employee into America or into Europe. There's already 100 things I'm trying to consider. So I think, from your perspective, Kerry, you did that into 4 different countries, potentially, maybe even 5?
5, yeah.
5 countries. I think it'd be good to hear your advice around things to consider, and I'll be making notes myself in the background.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually it ties into one of the questions that's there. What type of workforce would I need to hire to support my international expansion? The method that we followed that worked for us was hiring somebody locally, very experienced, somebody that had that leadership experience or potential, and then we could bring in more junior people to be trained up underneath them. But one of the things, and it links into another question: what's the biggest challenge you found in your international expansion so far? It is definitely the people side. So if you have a leader in your international company, your foreign company, that is somebody that you have a good, strong relationship with, who understands, they don't necessarily have to be from that country, but they need to intimately understand the country. They need to understand the nuances of the country. They need to be credible in that country. That for me is the biggest challenge so far. And it's very, very easy for your culture or your quality to go awry and not to know about it for a while, because there's different relationships, there's different sorts of hierarchies in certain countries. It's very, very hierarchical, and as a CEO, I genuinely couldn't get anybody to open up to me at all. Because I was, outside of their pecking order. In other countries, it was, very familiar, very friendly, and those are just the nuances that you come across. So I think the biggest challenges have definitely been people. Having said that, I'm going to mention the obvious ones that I think most people would come up with first. Tax. It is so complicated. There are things like establishing a permanent entity, which it is just a minefield. There are certain countries that have dual taxation treaties with the UK. There are certain countries that don't. In the US, as an example, the federal and the state taxes are very, very different. So it's almost thinking about the US as 52 different countries in terms of understanding the tax and the legislative environment there. There's things like registration requirements for the VAT, for Social Security, tariffs and export charges. And then also you need to consider, if you're taking some of your team to work in the US, to work overseas, about the impact on their personal taxation, and be able to mitigate against that for them. There's also intercompany trading. And obviously if you're doing intercompany trading, then that becomes way more complicated if you're trading across different entities and different countries. So choose a tax advisor that can really help understand not just the local tax situation, but is used to dealing with complex cross-border tax treatment, because it is ridiculously complicated. The other thing that is quite complicated as well, and varies hugely from region to region, even within the Eurozone, are visas and work permits. So if I look at somewhere like Sweden, in Sweden you have to register with the employment agency if it is that somebody's working for more than 5 consecutive days in Sweden. In Poland, if you're taking somebody on in Poland, there's a requirement to register the employees with with the Social Security Bureau within 7 days before commencement of work, but also there's a mandatory need to have a preventative medical examination before they commence work to ensure that they're fit for the work that's been done. So there is, you know, it's not good enough to take people on and go, we'll work it out afterwards. You know, so many of these things need to be in place or understood prior to doing anything in the overseas territory. I think I've already talked about leadership. So, you know, having that strong local leadership, but also having a commitment from senior leadership in the parent company to get actively involved. I know of somebody that had a business in India that was incredibly successful, but he went to India every month. He invited not just the team, but their families to team building events. He properly understood the culture there, and as a consequence, he grew an amazing business there, sold it for millions, and you know, had a really successful experience. Conversely, I know of people that have, you know, if we look at India again, have thought this is a low-cost place to invest. We'll just hire some people and that will be it. And the team haven't ended up doing what they expected they'd do. There's been high turnover of staff. People haven't felt valued or really felt that they're part of the overall organisation. So I think that's...
India, sorry to interrupt there, Cerys. India's a very interesting one, isn't it? Around if you expand into India, my understanding the last time I looked into it, it might have changed now, but I don't think it has, is you need an Indian national to be a shareholder on the board of whatever company you set up there, which obviously then makes the person who you're going into business with effectively, that has to be obviously trusted, and whether that's a senior person, etc., etc. So I think that's it's not a big challenge, but it's a big consideration, isn't it, for specifically the Indian market?
Oh, absolutely, and it's not just India. There are many markets that require a local investor, a local person to be on board as well. And that, you know, there are companies that will so legal companies will allow you to name one of their people to be that local board member. There are also agencies that offer to be the employer, and then they pass through the charges and make their margin there. So there are ways around all of this. It's not the first time that people will have tried to invest in the territory that you're wanting to go into, but it's absolutely critical that you do your homework in advance and really, really understand what's involved in it. You know, cost of living is another one. If I think about our team in the US again, we had a per diem rate that we gave people when they were working away from home on consulting projects. We had a group of people working in Seattle. The cost of living in Seattle was massively more expensive than the cost of living in Arkansas, as an example. So it's factoring that in. It's also about keeping your team safe. We're not that close to the geopolitical detail of countries overseas. We know the mood music of the UK, if that's where we live, and we can give a reasonably educated view as to what the future looks like and what the risks are. We had one of our team working in Thailand when there was the military coup in 2014. We got them out of there quickly, but it felt very reactive as opposed to having been closer to it, which we would have been had, you know, a similar set of circumstances been happening in the UK. Similarly, in South Africa, there were riots in South Africa in 2021, and it's then the impact on the team, and you always feel slightly behind the pace because the news that we get in the UK tends to be quite UK centric, and therefore trying to preempt where you might need to take action it's just harder to do it where it's overseas. And it's not just things like, you know, riots and unrests, but it's also understanding you want your team to feel safe wherever they are, and in some countries they do have different attitudes to race, to gender, to sexuality, religion, and so having team welfare as a number one priority when you're going into this, I think, is really, really critical, so that the people that you're deploying there feel safe and they feel valued and they feel that you're looking after them and they are your number one priority. And then we've also had personal emergencies. We've had, you know, someone who was an Indian national who we'd brought over on a visa to the UK, and one of his family members was critically ill, and it was about taking him off the project, getting him on a plane and getting him back to India as soon as possible, but then dealing with that period whilst he was away. And of course it happened to be a really critical time on the project as well. And then when we start to look at costs, there's things like healthcare. You know, obviously I don't need to talk to people about healthcare costs in the US. I think they're pretty well documented, but they are expensive. If you're wanting to cover your team for not just emergency, but routine healthcare as well, that really adds up. If you are taking over not just the individual, but their partner and perhaps their children as well, those costs can add up really, really quickly. There can be, you know, a plethora of local specific requirements, but I think on the business side as well, it's about thinking about how you portray yourself overseas. So you don't want to appear as a UK company who's operating overseas. You want to feel that you are, you know, if you're operating in Germany, you want to feel German. So, you know, the language that you use, the website, making sure that it's personalized to different markets. One of the most emotive and challenging things we had was a language barrier in, you know, US to UK language. There are certain things that we say in the UK that are translated differently in the US and vice versa. So it's not just a case of, do they speak English? Tick, you know, let's move on. It's being very, very aware of all of those different sort of preferences and habits. Things like marketing materials. If you look at the Germany market, they really like to have professional, glossy, well-written, detailed materials. If you look at other markets, you know, I'm thinking somewhere like Spain, that's less important, and you know, it's the relationship that matters there. PR and brand awareness, you know, it's not one size fits all. So what may resonate in the UK may not resonate somewhere else, and it's about trying to properly understand that. And then there's also things like the infrastructure of the country you're going to. So in South Africa, they don't have enough electric supply for demand, so they operate load shedding, which is where they just take bunches of postcodes out and turn their power off for a number of hours. So, you know, we've had to mitigate against that. It's caused productivity issues with our team. There's additional infrastructure investment that you need to put in offices there to make sure that you compensate and have generators to compensate for load shedding. Things like the prevalence of internet at home. And then, you know, just basics like communication. So it's nice to have an all hands meeting and everybody hears the same news at the same time. Well, that's really difficult if it's conflicting time zones or, you know, different languages. And you really have to work incredibly hard not to have teams feel like second-class citizens. And so having a handle on what's happening locally is really, really important. And sometimes, again, it's that you don't really hear what's happening locally. It can be that there's, I don't know, severe weather that's impacted an area. And you may just be talking about that in a group for the UK because you're aware of it, but you wouldn't necessarily be aware if it was happening in, I don't know, India or somewhere like that. There's also like the basics, like if you are trading somewhere overseas, you'll also need to engage with local suppliers. It might just be for, you know, providing laptops and phones to your team, but also then how does that link to your data protection and GDPR and you know, this sort of the cross-border impacts that can happen as a result of that. Things like where the post will go. Until very recently, we were receiving actual paper checks in the UK from a very, very large customer that were posted to our local office. So somebody had to be in the office, open the post and then go to the bank and cash the check in the bank, and then we had to wait for those funds to clear. So, you know, those little nuances that you don't necessarily think about and that aren't that sort of, you know, that sexy when you're talking about setting up a new operation overseas do impact on, you know, can impact on profitability and can also impact on cash flow as well. And then, you know, there is a drive to carbon neutrality, and I spent a huge amount of my time on flights, going to see customers overseas, also meeting with the team overseas. Now, you can be clever about it and make sure that you cover as much as you can in one journey. But it's, you know, my carbon footprint wasn't great for a few years. And I think one of the upsides of COVID is there's a greater acceptance of doing things remotely now, but you can't compensate for the face-to-face interactions and just things like, you know, team building. It's really nice to be able to have that informal interaction with the team when they're off duty, and when you, I don't know, you're having a game of bowls or you've gone to a bar with them or something like that, which, you know, you can't do over a Zoom or Teams meeting. And I think, you know, in business, as with everything, timing can be absolutely critical. And it's certainly been something that has been really, really beneficial to as an REPL to help generate growth. But because there are so many unknowns, it's really, really, really essential that you just research them thoroughly. So I think, in summary, I think there's a few different factors. So look at the economic factors, look at cultural, look at infrastructure, and look at legislative, and, you know, make sure that you leave no stone unturned on each of those.
No, that's awesome. I think everyone saw my pen waving in the background. I was actually writing things down there where you speaking. So that's really, really, really insightful. I think just a couple of questions that came through, I think, while you were talking there. One was around, you know, how do, in fact, I'll put it up so I get it spot on. One was how will I access local markets and customers when expanding internationally? And it's something we're going through at the moment. And I think what we did, we undertook a bit of analysis around looking at our current client base in the UK and understanding their footprint and their heritage, I guess, to an extent, and going, right, okay, you know, we found actually a vast amount of our customers were were either American owned or had a significant presence in America. Then we looked at another set of our customers, and they were either European or heavily European focused, and used us in the UK for certain things. So I think that's the first thing I'd say is look at your current client base and understand what they do, because if you're doing a good job for those guys in the UK, it's a much easier discussion to have when you are expanding, and you could support them in other territories. I think is the first thing. I think the second thing around sort of customers specifically as well is looking at who you currently help and look at their competitors. We use a term in our industry called avatars. So basically they're if you work with Tesco, what are Sainsbury's doing, for example, and look at those options as well, because again, it's an easier discussion around that conversation. And I think when you look at local markets for talent and resource, I think one of the reasons I guess Infinite have been quite successful in this so far is having a partner that can support you in multiple territories. I think is important. I think we've got a lot of our clients who use us in multiple geographies within the UK, geographies in the world, different geographies just within Europe, or different geographies just within the USA. I think for me, and obviously I'd love you all to use Infinite Talent for this, but regardless of who it is, you should look at your partners, and if you are expanding internationally, try and get a partner that can support you with that on the on the ground. I mean, when I've worked since Infinite started, I've worked with REPL and now Accenture on their recruitment still, and the stuff I support them on isn't just confined to the UK. It's Europe, it's America, etc., etc. And I think that partnership has lived on and survived because of that ability to support not just across one specific geography or one specific technology. So accessing local talent will comes from the partnerships you've got, and so do clients as well, because I know REPL had I think Jason's actually on the call about around the alliances side of things, and having partnerships with other companies that can almost help you intro into new customers and new opportunities. I think that's massively important. And then the other question was around where is it? There you go. So basically the talent scarcity influencing sort of economic challenges. I think the biggest challenge around that, personally speaking, is counter offers and people retaining the talent and constantly pushing the salary bar up and up and up, because let's face it, recruitment isn't cheap. If you use an agency, it's obviously good and you get an awesome service, but it's still a cost, right? And it's still a cost of attracting talent. So I think I'm not shooting myself in the foot, but having a great internal team that aligned to what they need to do. When I was at REPL, my focus was getting that internal team focused in verticals, and anything that was outside that vertical, go and use a specialist recruiter to help you on that. That will then, in the long run, save you cost, but also mean you get the best talent available. But I think in the current market, retaining a person and giving them a 10k pay rise, is that cheaper than coming to someone like myself and going, well, can you get me a person and you get a 12 grand bill from me? So I think it's a balance around that. And I think from an economic perspective, I think we'll see a lot more counter offers, and we are seeing a lot more counter offers because, as I say, the person, they've done a good job for you historically. Unless there's a major issue around culture and why you don't want to work there, I'd say 80% of the time, it's probably just money. It's the way that candidates approach that question internally. They feel they've got to leave to get the pay rise instead of having that conversation, I guess, with a good line manager or some form of HR representative. So that'd just be my thoughts on those two questions.
And also, if you look at somewhere like India as an example, I mentioned India at the start as being somewhere that's forecast to perform relatively better. The flip side of that is wage inflation is it's easily 10% or more, and culturally, there's an expectation that there'll be a significant salary increase every year, but not just a salary increase, but also a title increase every year as well. So, it's making sure that that's factored into your thinking and your planning too.
No, I agree. And I think, I'm conscious that we've got just a couple of minutes left, but I just think overall there's a lot of factors to consider, isn't there? And I think, I wouldn't want people to have the impression, and Cerys and I certainly aren't in this mindset, is you almost, it's like talking yourself into a recession. It's almost talking yourself out of doing something that could be a great opportunity. But, you know, you should make all these considerations and do it carefully in a way whereby, you know, me personally, when I'm dealing with a candidate that has to make a tough decision, I get them to draw a line in the middle of a piece of paper and put the advantages and disadvantages on either side and do that. And, you know, obviously in a more complex way, that's what we're saying here really is just evaluate the situation. And I think, you know, from an international business expansion point of view, I think obviously we haven't really got onto any horror stories as such, but for me, Brexit was a bit of a horror story, not for me personally, but for our client base. You know, it was causing absolute carnage, to be brutally honest, with how they were going to operate in these countries, and it's kind of took 2 years to get around all of that. So I think, you know, I think with that kind of situation easing a little bit, it does become now where you've got people who've been through that sort of process, which I think it makes it a little bit less turbulent to go into Europe specifically. But I mean, Cerys, thank you obviously for your time. I just wanted to open up the floor really to any more questions. I think we've answered all the ones that were on the Q&A function, but obviously we've got a couple of minutes, happy to answer any more, or obviously afterwards, I'll put my LinkedIn profile in the comments, and Cerys, I'm sure you don't mind sharing yours as well.
Yeah, absolutely, very happy.
Obviously people can reach out and hopefully, as I said at the start, you know, we want to create a little community whereby we'll do one of these webinars at least once a quarter, and we'll have some different guests on and different topics, you know, not just about international business. It could be a more tech specific topic, it could be a supply chain topic. I know when Cerys did the Women in Business one for us, there was a lot of stuff that came out the back of that probably deserved another webinar. So the Infinite in Session kind of brand could give us that opportunity to do a follow-up now. So yeah, any further questions, we'll happily take them. But if not, we can obviously wrap it up. And I think that is everyone, to be honest. I don't know.
Talk people into silence.
Yeah. No. I think they're.
Thank you, Dan, for facilitating this and for inviting me. I've actually really enjoyed it, and thank you for the questions that were asked as well. I think they're really good questions. There isn't a right or wrong answer, but I think what I would finish on is just reinforcing Dan's point that it's complicated, it's challenging, it's costly, it's time consuming, but it's definitely worth doing if it gives you a strategic advantage. So it's just about being aware. But if anyone wants to catch up with me separately and just ask about any specifics or anything like that, again, with the caveat, I'm no expert, but I can let you know my view. I'd be very, very happy to become part of your network.
Awesome. Cerys, thank you very much for the inaugural webinar. I look forward to having you as my co-host for the next one next year, and hopefully we can get some good guests on. If there's anyone obviously on the webinar now or that sees the recording that wants to be a part of it next year, obviously drop me a message and we can get you on as a guest. And obviously if you've got any topics you'd like us to cover in the series next year, obviously drop me or Cerys a message, and we can hopefully cover those and get an appropriate guest on to cover them. But thanks everyone for taking the time out at 5 o'clock in the UK, and yeah, have a good evening, and I'll catch you all in the new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.